Thank you, Laura, for writing this wonderful book, which is so fascinating, so well written, also with light touches about Indo-European. Now, just a moment ago, Namita Gokhale started us off the whole festival by noting that there are 22 languages, national languages, and many more dialects spoken here. And some of them, like Tamil or Japanese or Korean or Chinese or Arabic or Hebrew, are not part of the Indo-European language family, but by virtue of speaking Hindi, or as we are doing right now, English, or many of the other South Asian languages that are derived from Sanskrit, one could say that probably every single person here at the festival somehow participates in what we call a language family. So in this language family, so in a sense you have written a family history, and all families have histories, all families have secrets. Tell us a little bit about this family history and maybe some of its secrets.
Okay, so can you hear me? Oh yes, that's better. So the Indo-European language family, yes, embraces many of the North Indian languages, the offspring of Sanskrit, the Iranic languages, and all the way over, even in the ancient world, to the languages of Western Europe, including the Celtic languages, the Germanic languages, the Italic languages, including Latin, and later all its offspring. It's a huge family. It has roughly 400 living languages and dialects in it, and that's not counting all the ones that have died out in the 5 or so millennium that we think it's existed. And it is spoken today. So if in the ancient world it was already spread throughout Eurasia, it's now spoken on every continent. So in that sense, you could call it the most successful language family that there's ever been. Nearly half of humanity speaks an Indo-European language as a first language. So it's huge, although it does have rivals, notably the Sino-Tibetan family, of which Mandarin is the largest representative and could one day overtake it. But for now, it is the largest family. And for it coming to its secrets, for 250 years, people have debated, argued, wondered about where this language was born and who were its first speakers and where it came from, really. And the reason I wrote my book was because that story has taken, in a way, a great leap forward in the last 10 years. It's always been a story that has been told by linguists in dialogue with archaeologists, because we're talking about languages that were born before history, before writing, prehistoric languages. So history books are no good when it comes to getting back to the origins of this family. And what's happened in the last 10 years is that a new science has come along, which is genetics. Genetics is not that new, but the ability to read DNA from ancient human remains, and therefore to track ancient migrations, prehistoric migrations. And since people generally carry their languages with them for a while, and migration is considered for that reason a major, if not the main motor of language change, this information about where people were moving and how and in what numbers in the ancient world is really adding a huge piece of information to the story of the Indo-European languages, and has, we'll come to this, but has really strengthened one of the rival theories over all the others.
Great. So tell us a little bit about that origin story. Proto, it's your go-to origins. What are the main? Can you hear me in this microphone? Is that okay? Great. So where did Proto begin?
I mean, over those several centuries that this story has been discussed, and the story begins really with people's realization that there was such a family, that these languages from Sanskrit to the Celtic languages, from I should probably lay out the 12 branches of this family. Yes. So there are two that are long extinct: the Anatolian branch, which included the language of the great Hittite Empire, spoken on the Turkish peninsula. Tocharian, which is a language which I would wager that most people in this room have not heard of, once spoken at the northwest frontier of China. So in a geographical sense, or the easternmost branch of the family, also long extinct. Then the Indic and Iranic languages, Sanskrit obviously belonging to the Indic branch, which are so similar and so closely related that they're usually talked about, at least by linguists, as one single branch, Indo-Iranic. Then we have the orphan branches. By orphan, I mean that there's only one surviving language in each of these branches: Greek, Armenian, Albanian, Baltic, Slavic, Celtic, Italic, Germanic, and what have I missed out? I think that's it. That should make 12. So you can see the huge span that these languages were spoken in already thousands of years ago. And so it was a natural question to ask, if you have, so I was talking about where, how the family was defined. People noticed things like similarities between Latin and Sanskrit. The fact that Deus in Latin means God, as Deva does in Sanskrit, or septum is 7 in Latin, sapta in Sanskrit. Rex means king in Latin, or latterly meant king. And Raja in Sanskrit, these are the equivalents. So there was always this mystery, how to explain these very strange, are they just coincidences? It can't be a coincidence that so many words are so similar. And so people began to conceive of languages that had evolved from a common ancestor, and that's where the idea of the family came from. After they had defined this Indo-European family, the question arose, who were the first speakers? Who spoke that common ancestor, where and when? And that's been the debate of the last few centuries.
So what are the prevailing theories?
Coming to the theories. Okay, so there have been many theories on the table over the centuries. I mean, some really wacky ones. People have even placed them in the Arctic Circle, in the lost city of Atlantis. I suppose by the turn of this millennium, by the year 2000, say, there were two key rival theories that had still survived. One placed the origin of the languages on the Turkish peninsula, there where the Anatolian languages stayed, if you like. And the idea, mostly associated with the British archaeologist Colin Renfrew, was that it was the very first farmers who, when they began to multiply at the farming revolution 10,000 or so years ago, started to expand out of the Turkish peninsula and carried these languages with them east and west. The rival theory was the so-called steppe hypothesis, that these languages were born on the north side of the Black Sea, in the steppe of what is now Russia and Ukraine, and that they were spoken by nomadic herders, nomadic pastoralists who were specialists in that very hostile environment of the steppe, were extremely mobile, were used to moving large distances, and who were also very successful in the sense that they adapted very well to that environment, so their numbers increased, and as they moved out, they carried their languages with them. And that theory put the date of the family quite a lot younger, several thousand years younger, to about 5,000 years ago. So yes, there's a big gap of several thousand years between those theories, and what the genetic evidence did was to come and reinforce one over the other.
So both of these theories, they emphasize different lifestyles, the settled farming, the nomadic, but both of them are sort of in the same geographic area, sort of smack in the middle of the Eurasian landmass, right? And so in some sense, that seems like a plausible hypothesis. Where's the origin of this huge spread? It's somewhere in the middle. But there is also a theory that actually the origin lies closer to here, namely that is closer to Sanskrit and to the Indian subcontinent. Can you lay out
yes.
the rationale for that theory?
So this is the so-called out of India theory, and at various points in the history of this debate, there have been ideas that Sanskrit was the oldest language in the family, the possibly the original family, the equivalent of Proto-Indo-European. It's not a question, it's not a theory that can be ruled out entirely, but the weight of evidence, in fact, there is no certainty in this story. I should start by saying that. Because we're talking about languages that predate writing, we're talking about bringing different pieces of indirect evidence to the question and building a pile of evidence, basically, looking at the weight of evidence. But we can't directly say what languages were spoken then because we have no written evidence of these languages that are long dead. If we're talking about the weight of evidence, it seems unlikely, I'm acting as a conduit here for the experts, unlikely that India was the origin of the entire family, because there's no evidence of people moving from India to the places where the other Indo-European languages belong. Whereas we have now strong evidence of migration from the steppe into India, from the steppe also west into Europe. We also have much linguistic evidence of cognates, related words across the languages spoken in Russia, for example, the Slavic languages, the Baltic languages, similarities between Sanskrit and the Western languages, ritual similarities. So, for example, archaeological sites that have been excavated southeast of the Urals, where the very oldest chariots were found, where evidence of horse sacrifice were found from 4,000 years ago, that match up with many of the recurring linguistic themes in the oldest Indo-European languages, and with many of the mythological themes that have been handed down to us as well. An example of that, maybe just a quick example, is the word ratha, which means in both the Indic and Iranic languages a chariot, and which derives from the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European word rote, which is the root of rotate in English, and which originally referred, most linguists would agree, to a wheel, to people who were among the earliest to know wheel transport.
Fascinating. So you are really talking here about methodological difficulties, right? You're using about genetics. We can see how people from that region moved west, moved east, leaving their genes behind as evidence. But it's interesting because, as we know, languages, yes, maybe they spread like genes, like families, but we also know that, of course, someone not related to a people can start to speak a language. So what kind of sort of theory of influence is behind these different conceptions of how it spreads? How does one group of people get another group to adopt its language or some of its words, at least?
Yeah, that's a deeply fascinating question on its own. So I said earlier that when people move, they tend to carry their languages with them. And that is true to a very large extent, particularly in the ancient world. But it's a rule of thumb. It's not a concrete rule. There's no certainty about it. So, for example, if we come back to the subject of India, we know that Scythians, Greeks, Mughals invaded this country at different points in history. All of them essentially gave up the languages that they came in order to adopt the language of the indigenous people who they were attempting to conquer, succeeded in some ways, in some cases. So, but even that is never a black and white story. It's never one language simply gives way to another. You have the two languages influencing each other. You have loans between them of words, of expressions, of grammatical devices, of all sorts of things. So there are these two ways in which languages change, which makes language a very different beast in many ways from genes, from people. I mean, we transmit our genes, parent to child. That's how we transfer biological identity, if you like. But languages can be passed from parent to child, but they can also be learned. You can learn a second language, a third, a 14th language. You can learn a language from a book or an app, and you can lose languages. So there are the mechanisms are far more complex. And if we talk again about this idea that Sanskrit, or a forerunner of Sanskrit, was brought into India with migrants originally from the steppe, which is the leading theory of how Sanskrit came here at the moment, there is no doubt that it would have been influenced by the languages that were already spoken here, that the two would have shaped each other in very important ways. In fact, one of the ideas is the retroflex that is in Sanskrit and that was inherited by the offspring of Sanskrit was loan from languages that were already spoken here, notably Dravidian languages. So that's just one example of the ways in which languages are constantly molding, shaping, borrowing from each other.
To switch gears a little bit, you're talking about learning languages. How many languages do you speak, and what's your experience of learning languages?
The killer question. I am not a linguist, and I speak 2 languages: English, which is my mother tongue, and French, which is France is my adopted home. I live in France, so I speak both those fluently. I read some others a little bit, but that's it. In fact, at the age of 30, I was so ashamed of only speaking 1 language that I moved to France in order to learn a second. So my shame is a little bit diluted these days. Nevertheless, it didn't stop me writing a book about languages.
But I think that's a great story, because most people move and then have to learn the language, whereas you moved in order to learn French, and you now live with French in your daily life.
Yes, I do. I think it's one of the most. I think it's probably, for me at least, and I think this is very highly subjective, French is the most beautiful language in the world.
I see.
I don't speak many others, as I've just said.
Very good. Now, you are talking about the different theories of Indo-European and how they spread. This is a charged topic, in part because we have so many myths about languages. There's the biblical myth of, the Tower of Babel and different languages being a form of punishment, the very drastic theory of many languages. Many societies have similar kinds of myths about languages, how they came about, why we speak different languages, what it means to have to converse across languages. Can you speak a little bit about that sort of mythic dimension of languages and what they mean for cultures?
Yes. I mean, I suppose the first thing to say, which I do raise very early on in my book, is that language as a concept is inherently political. So even the difference between a language and a dialect, the famous expression that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, has an awful lot of truth to it. Or as the American linguist John McWhirter said to me the other day, a language is a dialect that got put up in the shop window. It's the one that got associated with the powerful elite very often, or that was spoken in the center of power in the capital. But these myths about language, so when I said, that the idea, the concept of an Indo-European language family and of all the other language families in the world, the concept of a language family is only several hundred years old. That's because prior to that, people had no concept of languages really evolving. There was this much more religious concept of a language as something rather static. In the biblical, in the Judeo-Christian universe, there was this idea that, Noah took the primordial language into the ark, that being Hebrew, and later his ancestors having annoyed God by trying to build a tower to reach heaven, those languages were scrambled and gave us the languages that we have today. And with a biblical understanding of time, none of those events could be much older than about 4,000 years. So there was no time in that concept of the linguistic universe for evolution to have happened. So that change in mindset took a very long time to come about. And that's why it's only a few hundred years that we've been discussing this story at all. But also, I don't know if I'm moving off the topic too much here, but it's a charged subject for many reasons. So language change might be associated by some people, I would say rather simplistically, with conquest. And that's a very common thing that happens. So the idea that nomads from the steppe brought an early Indo-European language west into Europe, for example, and they were numerically inferior to the population of farmers who were living there at the time and who spoke entirely foreign languages, and that within a few hundred years, possibly 1,000 years, the incoming languages, the Indo-European languages, were spoken across the European region, suggests that something very dramatic happened. And people assume it was violence. People assume it was genocide, rape, and that these nomads came in and basically killed and pillaged and raped and imposed their languages that way. And that was a sort of a prevailing pillar of the steppe hypothesis right up, I'd say, until about 10 years ago. And only in the last 10 years have people started to think about more nuanced explanations. So now I'd say that the prevailing explanation is much more complicated, much more nuanced, much more multifactorial. We're not ruling out violence. There may have been violence in places. And indeed, across the top of Europe, the Indo-European languages and the migrations that we can now track with genetics came in so fast that there probably was violence involved there. But there were much more, a lot more space is now accorded to the social practices of these people coming in. I realize I should have said that the genetic evidence basically reinforces the steppe hypothesis very strongly, because you can see evidence of a migration coming in from the steppe 5,000 years ago from what is now Ukraine and Russia, and 5,000 years ago fits very neatly with what the linguists date, how the linguists date the oldest Proto-Indo-European languages. So given that we have plenty of evidence from other sources, from other languages, that migration and language change often go together, this makes a very compelling, although again not certain or definitive, story. So how did they do it? There were perhaps tens of thousands of them compared to an estimated 7 million farmers inhabiting Europe at that time. And one idea is that violence was a contributing factor. Another idea is that there may have been pandemics. We're now able to trace not only ancient human DNA, but ancient microbial DNA, and there's gathering evidence that there was some form of plague in Europe at that time. Can't yet tell whether it was the nomads who brought it in or whether they were running away from it. But it could have decimated populations. They could have had differential immune powers to the microbes that spread these and other diseases. They also came with their herds, so they may have been exposed to diseases of animal origin for longer, lived more closely with them, had a stronger immune system in that sense. So they may have had an advantage in that way. Another theory is that it's to do with how those nomadic peoples who came in from the steppe organized themselves. They were highly mobile, unlike the farmers. And they had conventions and social institutions, if you like, that maintained their identity, kept them together, maintained their social cohesion over large swaths of space and time, because that was how they lived. And among these conventions, for example, was a very strong emphasis on hospitality. Hospitality. You are a stranger crossing my territory. I will welcome you in. I will wine and dine you, if you'll excuse the modern expression. And when I come back to your territory, you'll do the same for me. And there's even a reconstructed word that is thought to have represented this concept. It's hostis, which essentially combines the English words guest and host, and combines the concept, has this concept of reciprocal hospitality. And so these were people who were able to maintain social networks over very large spaces. They brought, for example, wives in from the communities with whom they came into contact, in this case, probably the farming communities, and they expanded by doing so, they expanded their space through probably raiding. We know that they, as mobile people, they also were quite fond of raiding other people and bringing new lands and new cattle and new livestock into their possession. And this hospitality thing acted as a kind of glue. They were very good at feasting, at telling stories. Bards were incredibly important in this society. William was telling us in his inaugural lecture about the people in villages around here who still today tell epic poems, which are not written down, epic stories, or at least not written down in front of them when they're performing, over up to 72 hours or even longer. So it's a tradition that goes way back, at least as far, we think, as these Proto-Indo-European speakers. And that through these social conventions, they were able to bring people into their networks and impose, although that seems slightly the wrong word now, their languages on them that way. That they married women, for example, those women took up those languages, but those women also brought in vocabulary from their languages and shaped the Indo-European languages as they went forward, as they continued to evolve, again, through the mechanisms we've described.
And I think you shared with me earlier that epic was in fact one of the potential titles for your book, and I can see how that would work well. And just to fill out this picture, you just described the way potentially how these nomads managed to influence Western Europe, and a similar scenario would be true for the move east to when these nomads would encounter the settled peoples of the Harappan civilization as well, I assume.
It's a little bit more complicated. So there is an idea backed up again by this DNA evidence of large distance, long distance migrations, that some of these nomads, whose name I should give now because they're known by the archaeological culture which is associated with them and which which was given a Russian name, Yamnaya or Yamna in Ukrainian. And there is now good evidence that some perhaps splinter group of these Yamnaya moved away to the east, so some moved west into Europe, others moved east, and moved eventually a shockingly enormous distance, given that they were in wagons or on foot. That's another debate, we're not quite sure, perhaps both, reached as far as China, modern China. Okay, so that is the presumed origins of the Tocharian branch of the family, which is considered to be the second oldest, the second to have peeled off, if you like, from the Proto-Indo-European trunk after Anatolian. The Indic story is a little more complicated in that the thinking is that there was a move into Europe, that's the first one I described, and then a back migration, a huge period of climate change, which caused drought in large stretches of Europe and which caused people to move back to the steppe with their herds. And that happened probably a little before 2000 BC, a little over 4,000 years ago. And the idea is that those people moved back into Central Asia and eventually, after a sort of interlude in these sites around close to the Urals that I was describing earlier, where the chariot was invented, moved on, splitting at some point, and some went into what is now the subcontinent, others went into what is now Iran, Persia, and the ancient world. And one of the fascinating sort of spin-offs of that story is that back migration from Europe into the steppe, one of the early splits was one branch going off towards the Baltic states, what's now Lithuania and Latvia, and then the rest continuing on towards India. So very early on in the Indo-European story, people noticed these resemblances, very striking resemblances between the Baltic languages, of which the closest is with Lithuanian, of the living Baltic languages, and Sanskrit. So just to give one example, the Ashvins, the charioteering twins of ancient Indic literature, have their counterpart in Lithuanian mythology are the Ashvienii. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So there are all sorts of echoes. Viras in Lithuanian, Viras in Sanskrit, Ugnis in Lithuanian, Agnes in Sanskrit, or was it the other way around? Very strong echoes of Lithuanian Sanskrit that we can explain potentially by this migration that split paths a little before 2000 BC.
Now, a little while ago, you mentioned that sort of conceptions of conquest and mixed feelings about conquest is one reason why this question is so politically charged. I wonder whether, by the same token, or to flip this around, it's also because, and the title of your book, Proto, sort of taps into that, that people have very strong feelings about first, about origins, right? Who invented what? Who was first? And the more I personally think about it, the more I think that there's much too much emphasis on a kind of cultural pride on these firsts, and that it doesn't really matter who invented what first, but much more what people who adopt a language or a cultural technique or an art form or whatever, what they make of it. I wonder whether you have a similar, you're telling an origin story, but you're also, I think in some sense, pushing back against a kind of conception of or kind of overemphasis on this first, on being first, and so much prestige being bestowed on that. Is that,
Yeah,
am I right about that?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I suppose the title of my book emphasizes that first concept, but that is the language we've inherited about how we, you know, the terminology, if you like, the technical language about how we refer to these languages and how we define a family and the common ancestor of a family. But again, the definition of a language is political, it's arbitrary. For example, one much cited definition of a language is that it's mutually unintelligible to speakers of a different language. But British English and American English are considered by most linguists different languages now, and yet they're mutually intelligible. There are dialects of German whose speakers cannot understand each other, yet they're all called German. Speakers of Danish, Swedish, Norwegian can understand each other, but those are three separate languages. So it's a bit of a nonsense, and you shouldn't set too much store by it, because you can easily find exceptions to any rule that you come up with. And there's a very real sense in which, just as, you know, biological species can be described as being distinct from each other, that again is an arbitrary label. In some sense, you know, all biological organisms go back to the very first ones. There's been a continuity in evolution and inheritance, and the same is true of languages. You could easily defend a definition of languages which would take you all the way back from the ones we speak today to the very first languages that humans spoke. So you pick your definition and you make your bet.
Yeah. And this line that a language is a dialect without with an army and a navy comes from Max Weinreich, a scholar of Yiddish, and so that resonates a lot. And just to maybe briefly touch on a last aspect of this political history of studying Indo-European, when I, growing up in Germany, first encountered this language family, I didn't encounter it as Indo-European, I encountered it as Indo-Germanic. And there is especially dark history of that conception being appropriated in Germany by the National Socialists. Can you maybe briefly comment on that as well?
So there's been many, let's say, slightly shameful, in retrospect, examples of people appropriating the original language of the Indo-European, and not just the Indo-European language family, but let's say the Indo-European family was the first to be studied. So as I write in my book, it's the one that's got the most outdated intellectual baggage being dragged behind it. The Nazis, yes, claimed that it was spoken by people they called Aryans, who lived in northern Germany and all had blonde hair and blue eyes and made pots in the same style. I mean, the very obvious error in what they did and what the British did when they claimed that they were just retracing their steps of their ancestors when they were going back to India, using the same story to their own advantage, was to equate language, culture, and biology, genes. And these things, the complicated idea to get across, and which I try to get across in my introduction, is that though these things are very informative about each other and often do travel together, they don't always travel together. You don't get this kind of one-to-one mapping. And that's been the realization, I suppose, of the last half century, perhaps a bit longer century. And it's what makes for a complicated, but I think much richer and more nuanced story.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that was, for me, what I learned so much from this book, but for me, the biggest takeaway is that complicated intertwining of culture, language, and biology, and that they are not the same, though complicated, related. That for me was one of the really important takeaways that I think is a really striking one.
I mean, yeah, just to say a word about, I explained why I wanted to write this book, in that the story had received a wealth of new information from this new field and had been filled out in really extraordinary and breathtaking ways. In many ways, much of the detail that we have now and we didn't have 30 years ago is really quite stunning. But another reason was that when I was talking to people in the three fields that contribute to this story, linguistics, archaeology, and genetics, before I'd really decided that I was going to write a book about it, they would say to me, you know, we don't speak the same language. In the literal meaning of the word barbarian, which is somebody who speaks a foreign tongue, that was its original meaning, we are barbarians to each other, linguists, archaeologists, and geneticists. And so it seemed to me that here was an opportunity for a science journalist to do something actually useful and to step in and tell the story in a way that they could understand each other, that they could speak to each other and see how their narratives, if you like, or the narratives they were attempting to construct spoke to each other and could be cross-referenced. And I mean, just to try and give one more illustration of why they speak different languages, it's not inherently a bad thing. If you think about genes, right? We all have a biological identity, which we inherit in some sense from our parents. And genes flow on, right? So an archaeological culture, which is an archaeologist's definition of a group's identity, and which manifests concretely in a bunch of recurring objects that they keep pulling out of the ground in sites that they assign to the same culture. Somehow, cultures rise and fall. Cultures vanish at some point in the archaeological record and new ones arise. But the genes flow on. So there are already two different concepts of identity. And language, again, as we've said, is transmitted by a different method again, a sort of, in a way, a combination of the vertical, the inheritance, and the horizontal, the borrowing. So these three things are transmitted differently, but that's okay because we all have a very multi-layered, I think, concept of our own identity. You know, we might inherit, we might have one cultural identity from one parent, we might speak the language of another parent, and then we've got the biology that we get from both. I tell this story in the book, which I think illustrates it quite nicely. It was a story that was on the BBC a few years ago about a woman on a bus wearing a niqab talking to her young son, and she got interrupted by another passenger on the bus who told her rather peremptorily to speak English in the United Kingdom. And he got told off by another passenger who pointed out that the woman in the niqab was speaking Welsh and was in Wales. So, you know, identity is complicated. There are many layers to it, and that's what we have grasped, I think, finally in the last half century.
And Welsh, I learned from your book, is actually another word for barbarian or incomprehensible.
Exactly. It's the same root as walnut, which was usually to Germanic speakers a nut from France. The Walloons, which shares the same root, were the northernmost French speakers, again to the Germanic speakers. So yeah, these words have the same root.
Wonderful. Now, I think this might be a good moment to turn it over to you, and we have a little bit of time for a few questions. What I'm asking you is A, to wait for the microphone to come to you, and B, please, please, don't give a long speech. Ask one pointed question, and Laura will be delighted to answer it.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. So, yeah, that's me.
Where is that microphone?
Here.
Okay.
Oh, yes, hi.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, so I
Hold
wanted
closer,
to ask
please.
you.
Hold closer.
Can you hear me?
Closer.
The microphone closer. It's hard to
Closer?
understand.
Can you hear me now? Not.
It's okay. Just speak up. I think we can hear.
All right. So my question was whether languages can be seen also as an extension of your identity in a negative sense, or also in the context of persecution. For instance, if you see the Basque, that's identity. And if you see the Romani, who originated supposedly from India, they have also preserved their language. So would you say that that is more of a modern context, a modern narrative, or is it a part also of the ancient narrative?
That's a very good question. So Basque, as you know, is a sort of island of a non-Indo-European language surrounded by this sea of Indo-European languages. And that thinking now is that it's older. It's a relic of the languages that those farmers would certainly have brought in when they spread into Europe several thousand years before the nomads from the steppe. And somehow, unlike all the others, it resisted. Now, resisted itself is a word that we have to qualify, because Basque contains many Indo-European words by now, which is completely as you would expect after thousands of years of cohabitation. And in fact, Basque originally was a very profound influence on the incoming Indo-European languages. Now the influence tends to be in the other way. But when you think about one of the fascinating things I think this illustrates really well is how important geography has been in this story, because Basque is spoken, I mean, it was originally spoken in a much larger area, we presume, but it's still spoken in the heartlands of the Pyrenees, in this sort of mountain kingdom. And same with Albanian. And I think that has somehow helped the speakers of those languages to resist to some extent, perhaps very straightforwardly, in the sense that they could keep out the people more easily from their mountain kingdom, but perhaps also it gave them, I mean, it probably operated on many layers. They had a stronger perhaps sense of their group boundaries and where they came from. And all of these things help them to keep the identity together, and then you get these sort of two-way feedbacks between the identity reinforcing the language and the language reinforcing the identity. In the case of the Romani, of course, that's a very exceptional story, because the pejorative term gypsy that was originally applied to them was because people thought they came originally from Egypt. Now we know they came from India, and there was this 10,000-year exodus and shift west in phases. And in fact, you know, to come back to this idea of how languages shape each other horizontally as well through loans, one of the ways we've pieced together that journey that the Romani underwent, eventually ending up in Europe, is through linguistic loans. So for example, we know that common Romani picked up Persian words when it was passing through Persia. Some of them are Persian words for honey, pear, donkey, but it didn't pick up any Arabic words. And that helps us date when the speakers of Romani were in Persia, because it must have happened before the Arab invasions of the 7th century. So these loan words can be really useful markers in that sense, sort of traces of contacts of languages. But the Romani people, obviously, they weren't in their mountain kingdom. They were moving through peoples over large distances and large periods of time, and yet managed to maintain an identity. So, you know, and yes, they've been persecuted because they were nomadic, because they were moving through. Did that reinforce their identity, perhaps? These things work in curious ways, and sometimes in both directions at the same time. Yeah.
Great. We have, where's the microphone? Yes, great.
Yeah. So,
please hold the microphone very close to your mouth.
In several cultures, a bursting of a lake is common. For example, in several cultures, the Noah's Ark and its equivalent is very common. Okay, it's present in Hindu mythology. It's also present, surprisingly, in Jewish mythology. And it's usually associated bursting with the Caspian Sea. And that suggests a very different connection between these two cultures.
Closer.
Did you say that the Noah's Ark myth is associated with many different cultures?
Yeah.
But you said it was linked with the Caspian Sea?
That's one idea, that the lake that burst was actually, you know, part of that, which is very plausible geographically.
So there is indeed a theory that when the sea rose at the end of the last ice age, the Black Sea, which had been a sort of brackish lake for many thousands of years while the sea was much lower and the world was frozen, became reconnected again to the world ocean. That is, the water came pouring over from the Mediterranean over the Bosporus ledge, as it was now straight, and perhaps caused some kind of tsunami, some flood, perhaps then flowed on out of the Black Sea into the Caspian Sea. There are different ideas about how this might have happened, how this reconnection of the Black Sea might have happened, but nobody really doubts that it did happen, perhaps in the last 10,000 years. The exact date is also debated. Did that give rise to many flood myths? It's the theory that's been put forward. It's very difficult to prove because flood myths are told in many different parts of the world. It's a nice idea, but very difficult to trace back, mainly for the reason that I've alluded to already, which is that we're talking about a time before writing. So we can only speculate about really the origins of where these myths came from. But would there have been eyewitnesses to that shocking tsunami flood? Probably. Would some of them have survived in order to hand down tales of it? Probably. All I'm saying is it's not a theory we can prove either way. But yes.
And this is maybe a good conclusion to the session. There will be book signing and opportunities to talk to Laura afterwards. Language, a fascinating topic, and you lay it out so wonderfully. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin.